Welcome to Developing Story with America Media. I'm Colleen Dulle, one of the hosts of the Inside the Vatican podcast, and joining me here in Vatican City today live is my co-host, Gerard, America Magazine's Vatican correspondent. Jerry, thanks for joining me on the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And thanks to all of our viewers at home who are watching along with us today. Just a reminder before we get into our conversation that you can share your questions with us on social media about the Sexual Abuse Summit and what's going on here in Rome this week, and we'll be glad to answer a few of them on air. So Jerry, just before we get into asking you some questions, I want to recap for everyone today what happened here in Rome. So today was the first day of the Bishops' International Summit on Sexual Abuse. This is the first time that the Vatican has ever had a meeting like this, in which they're bringing together all of the presidents of bishops' conferences from around the world. And they're bringing them together in order to discuss possible solutions to the sexual abuse crisis. So today was day one, and day one really focused on the theme of responsibility. And that responsibility took a few forms that we saw. We saw the bishops talking about listening to survivors and, in fact, listening to the survivors' testimonies. We also saw them talking about concrete actions. Now, Jerry, the first thing I wanted to ask you about on the show is that Pope Francis kind of surprised the people who were attending this meeting with a list of 21 reflection points that were all based on concrete actions that he wants them to think about taking, right? And these took a wide range of topics. Some of them were very administrative, some of them dealt with, the way that bishops' conferences and religious orders should work together. Some of them were as basic as, let's try to change the marriage age in canon law. What did you find interesting about this list?
Well, I thought, first of all, when he arrived this morning and they had the prayer session, and then he said, he gave a very, very short talk. He said, basically, we don't want condemnation, anything like that. What we want is concrete measures. And he repeated, concreteness. Mm-hmm. And then he went on and surprised everybody by producing 21-point roadmap, like 21 milestones on the road to getting concrete action. Mm-hmm. And he'd obviously come up with this because he had read reports that the bishops had sent in, and he'd seen where they were kind of deficient in terms of responding, or where perhaps they weren't even responding.
Right. And so, you should mention for the viewers that they had asked all of the bishops to say what they're working on, what each conference is doing to address sexual abuse.
Yes, they'd asked kind of a feedback from the bishops before the conference to say, what in your country is your church doing to combat abuse? Mm-hmm. This morning, what the Pope did, he gave them these 21 points, and I saw them looking at these sheets.
Right.
I'm wondering, what is this? And the first one was, let's produce a practical handbook to guide you through dealing with cases of abuse. Mm-hmm. It's very kind of basic, really.
Right.
You buy new television and you get a handbook on how to make it work.
Exactly.
And here's the Pope saying, you got a problem in your country. Mm-hmm. We'll come up with a handbook to help you deal with it.
Right.
I think that was very interesting. Then he goes on to deal with several other questions. Mm-hmm. He speaks about the question of dismissal from the ministry. He calls it dismissal from the ministry.
Yes, that was the topic of much debate during the press conference today.
Afterwards, when we came out from the press conference, we saw the victims outside and saying, well, he's not saying zero tolerance.
Right.
And Peter Isley, who is one of the founders of SNAP, but who's also one of the founders of the
support network for those abused by priests.
Yeah, the End Child Abuse International Network.
Yes.
He said it's absent, this expression zero tolerance.
Right.
And yesterday, you remember at the Foreign Press Association, he was speaking and he said, by zero tolerance, I mean two things. One, the removal of the priest from the priesthood if he abuses a child. Mm-hmm. And secondly, the removal of the bishop from the priesthood if he covers up abuse.
Right.
It's a very clear definition.
There's less clear of a definition coming out of this meeting, at least on day one.
Well, the reality is where the American church is at, and Peter Isley is American,
yes.
is not where many other countries are at.
That's
I mean,
true.
we heard Father Zollner, who's the coordinator of this meeting, Jesuit. He said, I was in Lebanon last week, and they cannot, it's a big problem even to bring the issue out publicly that a child is abused.
Right.
Because if a child does so, or a young person or a family member does so, they're isolated from the clan and from the family.
Yeah.
And in society, it's not acceptable to do this.
And I think that brings us to one of the main points of this meeting, which was they're really trying to get all of the bishops on the same page about sexual abuse. They're trying to explain that, you know, this is a problem worldwide. This is something that we all need to have a coordinated effort to solve and to, you know, come up with solutions to. I think that brings us to the second thing that I wanted to ask you about, which was the other point of responsibility that the bishops talked about today and that they participated in was listening to victims, right? And one of the things they did was listen to video and audio testimonies of different survivors of abuse, one from each continent, 5 continents. And I wanted to ask you, you know, what did you think was the most striking from those? We received copies of these testimonies.
Yeah, we saw the text, and
we didn't hear
I think it would be very beautiful for them to be disseminated as well.
Yes.
We didn't see the videos, only the participants, 190, which is bishops and cardinals and patriarchs from maybe more than 130 countries. They saw it.
Superiors general of different
religious
orders.
And the superiors generals, men and women.
Yes.
Somebody told me afterwards, he said that there was the silence of the cemetery in the room after these people had spoken. And it's very significant. The messages were very short. There was this woman from Africa who was saying that if she didn't have sex, if she didn't allow this guy to abuse her, she wouldn't get money,
beaten,
and
right?
she was beaten.
Yeah.
And then you have this guy from Dulle saying, you know, I appeal to the church.
Right.
He said, we were treated as liars. We were considered outcasts when we denounced our abuse. And of course, this is the experience of so many in these years. But they were putting it so powerfully. And then you had a member of a religious order also talking about this and how he went to his superior and went to the bishop, and the response was really despicable.
Right.
And so it's very good that these different type of problems are put on the table here. Pope Francis has always said that if you don't listen to the victims, you don't feel it, and then you don't have the motivation to change.
Yeah. Archbishop Coleridge said something really interesting this afternoon at the press conference about listening to survivors. You know, he said, I've listened to survivors a lot in my time as a bishop, but what really struck me today was that I heard them in this context in which there were all these bishops gathered who had to listen to them, and the Pope was there, and they were really being heard on this high level for the first time. I thought that was moving the way that he told that story.
And Archbishop Coleridge was from Australia.
Correct.
So he comes from what has been
a lot of
real turbulence seen in these years. But remember that before this conference, last December, when they sent out the invitations and gave the questionnaire to the bishops, the Pope asked every participant to meet abuse victims before they came to the conference.
Right, really emphasizing this listening and the importance of it.
And having the 5 victims speak to them today is reinforcing that message. If you don't get it, you won't be able to respond. And I think this was very, very powerful. And then, of course, we went into the talks, because today's meeting was about responsibility, the responsibility of bishops and religious superiors in dealing with abuse. Tomorrow's is about accountability, and then Saturday's is about transparency.
So today's talks we heard first from Cardinal Tagle from the Philippines, and he discussed the importance of seeing the wounds of Christ in these wounded people and also in ourselves, right, and not being afraid to confront that.
That was a very powerful testimony because his was more of a reflection. He didn't get into canon law. He didn't get into...
It's very emotional. He
teared up sometimes. And you saw at the end, they applauded.
They did.
He obviously, he's a great communicator. I mean, he has had his own television show before he was bishop, and he's a natural communicator. And he studied, of course, in the Catholic University in
the
Washington.
Philippines? Oh.
In Washington, yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes. And he's now head of Caritas International, the president.
Sure.
So he knows all these situations. But the way he put it was, these are the wounds of Christ. And of course, going around with Caritas and seeing the different wars, the natural disasters, people suffering.
He's no stranger to woundedness.
No stranger to woundedness. But that he put it in a language that everybody present. The Pope's aim is that here they all get on the same page. Tagle started well.
Yes.
Because he talked in language that everybody knew. So, we have to be with Christ, be the Samaritan, etc.
And continuing with that theme of getting everyone onto the same page, we also had this kind of very technical talk from Archbishop Scicluna that followed.
Yeah, I remember one of the big television networks phoned me and they said, well, this talk from Tagle, it was very basic. We were expecting something higher level.
Right.
I said, you've got to understand. Tagle is making sure that everyone is on the same page from the starting point. Because if they don't know how to deal with the abuse question and, the different steps to take, you're not going to get results. And so in a way it was like a primer, a kind of the Pope spoke about a handbook, and Tagle was kind of giving kind of the first chapter of this handbook in this meeting.
And then chapter 2 was Archbishop Scicluna, who spoke about a lot of
Scicluna was giving this first chapter.
Handbook.
Yep.
Sure. Which was very technical about here's what our protocols are, here's what we stand for already, and here are some starting suggestions for how to begin to improve this.
Yes, and he not alone did he deal with how to handle cases and how to listen to the victims, but he said, we've got to get also on to, he said, we bishops, our people have to trust us. They have to know that we're
on their
trusting
side.
them and that we're prepared to give our lives to save our flock.
Yeah, that was the most striking part of that talk.
Very powerful language. And then he said, we've got to start at the acceptance of candidates for the priesthood. We've really got to screen them.
Right.
And in the seminaries, we've got to make sure of the formation they're getting. So starting at point 1. And then he went to the other side. He said, when it comes to the selection of bishops, we've also got to exercise great care.
Yeah.
And he said, there's a demand that the lay people have a voice. And he wasn't saying do it, but he's throwing out the notion very clearly and making clear that he agrees with it. And this could well end up in the proposals at the end.
Yes, so we'll see what happens with that, and also with the rest of this summit. We have ongoing coverage at americamagazine.org, where you can find reporting not just from myself and Jerry, but also from our national correspondent, Michael O'Loughlin, who has joined us to cover this historic summit. We also have a podcast episode coming out tomorrow of Inside the Vatican, which you can find on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. So please follow that ongoing coverage of this historic summit. There was so much that we didn't get to talk about today, and it's only day 1. So thank you all for joining us on Developing Story with America Media, and thank you, Jerry, for your insights.
Thank you.